conversation and talk about some things that most people may steer away from or avoid talking about because it's tough. Do we have permission to do that today?
Can we keep it real? Okay.
No microphone. You see that? I like that.
That's my cheerleading coming from.
So let's talk about this concept of prejudice versus racism. So prejudice is something that we all have, right? Prejudice is innate within us. That's how we categorize things, okay? There's this such thing as called mental schemas. Mental schemas are how we categorize things in our brains in order to make sense of those things. So an example of that would be if a four-legged animal with fur, with the tail and pointy ears walked in the room, what would we say that is? The cat, right? He said a deer. See, there, yeah. That's Jared with the glasses, guys. He's up front. No, right? We would categorize that as a cat because in our brains we've already put that into one of our mental schemas in order to make sense of that, right? So that's how we, from a prejudice standpoint, we make sense of things. So if a gentleman walked in a room with his pants sagging, with his hood on, with headphones on, where would we put that?
Deer, right.
A college student, right? The reality is, many of us, when I said that, we all put them based on where we thought, or our interactions with people who have had their pants down with their hood on, with their headphones, right? We make sense of it based on our reality, based on our experiences. So we all have prejudice within us in some way to help us make sense of things. Now, racism, on the other hand, is a conscious thought. Racism is something that says, if something happens, I'm surprised, right? So there's a quote from Renee Aziz that says, anytime you feel surprised, that means you were expecting something different. So what we often get quite a bit is, you guys are very well spoken.
Articulate.
You guys are very articulate. Because when we speak, if you don't expect that from us, that means that you were surprised that we were able to speak in such a way or a manner that is articulate, right? So that's a form of...
And it's always like, you guys are so articulate. It's like with the in front of it, like, interesting. Not just like, oh, you're very articulate. It's the with it.
So as we think about this, and as we go through this content today, again, we want to make sure that you have open minds and open hearts, because we want to give some perspective from a self-awareness standpoint, but also, again, as Janelle mentioned several times, from a systemic standpoint, and how these things are played out, how prejudice is formed, but also how racism has impacted where we are today.
As it pertains to prejudice, we literally have to have prejudice. We all have it. Because we're taking in so much information that your brain cannot store all the information that you're taking in. Categories are necessaries and a necessary part of how we're built. And so this isn't about, one particular group of people or making people feel guilty. This is literally about how our brain works and categorizes information and having awareness so that we don't fall into the other category. So, I don't know if you guys are familiar with this gentleman. His name is Mitch Landrieu. He's the former mayor of New Orleans. He now has his own nonprofit organization called E Pluribus Unum, which means out of many one. And they're doing work to help address some of the systemic and racial issues in our country. And so they did a study where they asked 800 participants. They did 800 interviews across 28 different communities in 13 different states. And they literally interviewed white, black, Latino, across the board. They literally interviewed no matter what the socioeconomic background was. They wanted a very diverse segment of the population. And what they found, they released a study called Divided by Design. And what the study quotes, or that what they found, was that the ways that we think about race and culture is very different between people of color and white populations. Many of the white respondents felt as though racism is a individual act or thoughts of malice about a particular people group, Whereas most of the people of color who responded felt as though racism was systemic in nature, and that our country and many of the systems that our country was built on are rooted in racism. It was a much more systemic view of things, more deeply rooted. And so what Mitch and his team found, and here's a quote from him: "If we want a different outcome, we have to intentionally redesign the foundation." So what he found was that it's necessary for us, just like racism was institutionalized intentionally over years, it has to be intentionally deinstitutionalized, which means we have to rebuild a shared future together intentionally. We have to look at the systems and structures and the ways things are built and set up in racist beliefs and principles, and we have to intentionally be mindful of that and try to make different changes and choices.
So as we looked at Mitch Landrieu's research and looked at everything about what he's done in New Orleans and the different changes that he's made in different communities that he visited, we then took a serious look at our community to address and to evaluate and say, where are we as a city? Now, when we say where are we as a city, we're not talking about necessarily the structures and buildings within our city from a city, but as a people. Where are we as a community of people, a body of people who live and reside here in Fort Wayne? So I always love this image because we live in a time where we're all about equality, right? How many times have you heard that? We want to be equal, right? No, everybody deserves the same. Let's just be equal. But the reality is, majority of the time, you have individuals who get less, you have individuals who have just enough, and then you have individuals who get more based on, socioeconomic status, based on education, things of that nature. But if we can get to a point as a community where we look at it from a place of equity, right, where we give individuals what they need, okay, there's a reality that there are some parts of town, there are some population groups that don't need more resources, right? That could have a little bit taken from them and given to other sides of town or other parts of town. So many people will say, if we develop downtown, if we develop out north, right, we also need to develop southeast, right? What if we develop southeast and take a little bit from downtown and take a little bit from out north because of the development that has already taken place? Imagine what that could do for our community as a whole from an equity standpoint. And as we've been able to kind of have these conversations and talk to different people, and again, these conversations have taken place across ethnic and racial lines. So we've talked to our white counterparts, we've talked to our African American counterparts, and some of the things that stood out to us and some of the quotes are as follows. One of our friends said, "After I moved here, I was looking for housing in a diverse neighborhood and really struggled to find the amount of diversity that was normed in other cities I've lived in." So these are individuals who have come from different places that have very diverse communities and moved into Fort Wayne, and these are their opinions. While interviewing, I stated that I wanted to work with populations in the inner city, and I was strongly discouraged from working on the south side of town. So this is a conversation that we have often with individuals, may it be practitioners and doctors, may it be business owners. They're persuaded or convinced because of the population that's in Southeast or because of the lack of resources that's in Southeast, that it would not be a good place to start a business or a good place to start a practice. Another quote, "Moving here, I was shocked by the amount of segregation still present. I wanted to build a new home in the community I love, the south side of town, but couldn't find a builder who would agree to building in that area." So this is something we talked to a friend about, but this also holds true for Janelle and I. We're born and raised in Southeast Fort Wayne, very passionate about our community. And a few years ago, when we decided to build a home, we wanted to build in Southeast Fort Wayne. We literally could not find a builder who would build in Southeast Fort Wayne. No builder would say, "We would build you a home of the caliber that you desire in the place that you love in Southeast." We could not. So we ended up having to move right on the other side of I-69 in order to get a home built, to stay close to Southeast Fort Wayne, but we could not stay in Southeast Fort Wayne. And that is the reality for a lot of people who desire to stay in Southeast Fort Wayne. One that really stood out to us that came from our white counterparts who recently moved to Fort Wayne and desired to live in Southeast was, I just relocated to the south side of town and tried to order pizza from my favorite local restaurant that is also located in that area, and was told they can't deliver to me because I live in a no zone. So this individual tried to order pizza at a certain time, and they were told they can't be during the day. It was during the day. And they were told they can't get their pizza delivered because it's a no zone. Because of in reality, a no zone is because of the caliber of people who live in that area and the risk that it takes in order for us to deliver you a pizza.
Before he moves on, I just want to slow down a little bit because already there's been a lot of information shared, and the information that's been shared is kind of challenging. I want to add that these comments that we're talking about are from our white friends, not just our white counterparts, our white friends who feel like they can be completely honest with us because we have a lot of conversations cross-culturally about these challenging topics. And the Pizza Hut comment, I don't know if it was Pizza Hut or what she didn't say.
Domino's.
Okay, so that was actually put on LinkedIn, and you may have seen it, but we had an opportunity to talk with her in more detail afterwards, and she was so surprised by it because she had just moved to the southeast side of town and had never had that experience prior. And it was so eye-opening and disturbing for her. She didn't know what to do with that emotionally. And so I think the thing to think about is this stuff is really hard to discuss, and it's easy for us here in Fort Wayne to feel like we don't have an issue with race and culture because we have a lot of cross-cultural relationships. But someone that I was talking to recently said that we are Midwest nice here. That's the first time I heard that term, but it clicked when I heard it. We're Midwest nice, which means that we have these great cross-cultural relationships and we have this great community, but we keep things at a surface level. And it's great as long as we don't get too deep, or we don't open up old wounds, or we don't talk about this stuff that's challenging or painful to talk about. But from a family dynamics perspective, you guys know how healthy is a family that stays surface level. They may think that they're close, but if you don't get deep with people, then you don't really have that level of intimacy required to sustain relationships long term, to really know each other, to really connect. And so we have to start having these challenging conversations so that we're not just surface level Midwest nice, but we can really get into relationship and begin to see people as people and get that humanness, that connection that's required for us to really have community. So a little bit about how we got here, and this isn't anything unique to our city. This is maps of Fort Wayne specifically, but this is a common practice that took place across the United States. So I don't know how many of you have heard of the term redlining. Redlining was a New Deal practice where banks and financial institutions refused to give loans for businesses or home loans to people in certain areas based off the characteristics of the people who lived in that area. And so there were certain places or parts of town where if you applied for a loan, you would be denied. This was a common practice that took place across the U.S. In lots of different cities and communities, and Fort Wayne is no different. And there are actually websites where you can Google the maps of redlining, and it shows you specific redlined areas within cities. So in Fort Wayne, that area that is redlined, the red area at the bottom there is Southeast, the Southeast community. That's like the Buchanan Street area, right in there. And so everything south of that. And when you click on the description as to why it was redlined, it said that it is undesirable. The area is undesirable because it is highly inhabited by Negroes and aliens. There was no other reason why it was redlined other than the fact that it was highly inhabited by Negroes and aliens. And that is what the documentation says. And so our city was built up around these maps. And so it's hard to look at, but it happened. So it's easy to look at the Southeast community or the people who are living in Southeast and to feel a certain way about that, but we have to look at the history and how things got the way that they were. So as we are looking at these redlined areas, one thing that is common, this isn't, like I said, it isn't unique to Fort Wayne, but this is true in Fort Wayne. This is Fort Wayne data that we're looking at. There are lots of issues and barriers that get created because of the history of how those areas were structured. So over time, historically, there's been areas of town that were underdeveloped compared to the other areas. And now that we're growing so much with development in other places, it's kind of more pronounced and you can see it more, but it's always been that way. And so I'll let Aaron tell you a little bit about the findings and the work that we're doing.
So as mentioned, redlining is a New Deal practice that took place many, many years ago, but the reality is it's still impacting our communities today. And some of the things that kind of point to how it's impacting our community today, and I'll just point out a couple of these in the middle that are in red. How many of you are familiar with the infant mortality rate here in Fort Wayne? So here in Fort Wayne, and Southeast Fort Wayne in particular, in the zip codes of 46806, 46805, I believe, have the highest infant mortality rates in the state, higher than some third world countries. And what that means is we have black babies dying right here in the city of Fort Wayne and Southeast Fort Wayne at higher rates than that in third world countries. Infant mortality means they're dying before their first birthday. Okay? And there's a lot of studies out there to figure out why this is happening. And I can tell you that it has nothing to do with socioeconomic status. It has nothing to do with education. There's been research that shows an African-American mother with a PhD has a greater risk of her baby dying than a white mother who has no education. So when we look at it, we can't point the finger at the person or their conditions or where they live, because those aren't indicators to why infant mortality is high. So then we have to look at access to health care. We have to then look at systemic issues that have been created to put individuals in these situations. So the food deserts. How many of you are familiar with food deserts? Right? Food deserts are areas that don't have access to healthy foods, right? Southeast Fort Wayne is one of those areas that's considered a food desert because of the lack of grocery stores or access to the healthy food items. We were in conversations with some individuals that work at one of our local grocery stores, and what they shared with us was they're actually, they were responsible for stocking at Kroger's North. And what they shared for us was they had some bad produce that came through the truck, and they said, hey, what do you want us to do with this bad produce? And the response they got was, send it south. Send it south, right? And what we also know to be true is that the Southtown Walmart, some of their prices are marked up. So if you go north or west to Walmart, you may be able to get things at a little cheaper price than you would at Walmart South.
You're being real explicit.
Sorry.
He's naming names and being real explicit. I would have just said a store.
No. But I think it's important. I think it's, yes.
So I'm just going to second what you're saying. We've had conversations. I also work at Parkview. It's a prominent provider in this community. But when you name names, as you have, I won't repeat them, but you said a grocery store's name. If you've walked into the two different ones, there's two prominent, huge ones, real close, and one north, and the one down south. Completely different level of care of the store, but no level of difference for how much they care about their community. And so I think it's interesting, you've named the grocery store specifically, the square footage is different, the what's available is different, how many people are available to assist you is different. I think you're saying things that if you've taken the time to go and look at them, it's obvious. And so I just want to commend you for the work you're doing to try and call out how it's different.
Yeah, and I know I am saying some names, and I don't say names in order to down talk or downplay or criticize or do any of that to me, but the truth is truth, right? Reality is reality, and sometimes we can't get to the root of issues because we talk around the issues, right? So sometimes we have to call a spade and say what it is so that we can really start to address what the real core issues and problems is, which then further leads me into this. So how this document came to be is when we started doing our work in Southeast Fort Wayne, which started many, many years ago, before we actually got into our line of work with Parkview, we went around literally to every nonprofit organization within Southeast Fort Wayne that either served the population directly or funded these organizations, and we asked them, what are the things you're focused on? What are the things that you typically fund? Why do you typically fund those things? And what we got was a lot of these things that are in red. So infant mortality was a big one. There's a lot of dollars and a lot of funding around infant mortality because it's obviously a major problem. Addiction, when we talk about the opioid addiction, when we talk about the heroin addiction and substance abuse, toxic stress, disease, food deserts, job opportunities, all these things, obesity was a big one. All these things that are in red is what a lot of organizations were spending their time focused on, right? Rightfully so, because all of them are important. But what we noticed was your things that are around the outside in the darker blue color, things like lack of economic development, mental health, access to preventative resources and healthcare. Those things were going pretty much unaddressed. Or if they were being addressed, they were being addressed at a very minimal level. And for us, those things that are around the outside are core issues. So the things that are in the red bubbles are symptoms, right? So there are things that are, unless you touch on the things on the outside, those things are always going to exist and persist. So an example of that is the lack of economic development in Southeast Fort Wayne. If we were to build one full-service grocery store that had access to quality foods and items, right, that will create job opportunities. So you see that impacted from in the middle. It would address food deserts. It would address violence because more young people would then be able to be employed and have jobs and be off the streets. It would address infant mortality because one of the biggest indicators is the lack of access to healthy foods and maternal health. So just by building or looking at economic development, we're starting to address some of those issues that are in the middle. Janelle, and I see your hand, I promise I'm gonna come to you. Janelle likes to liken it to a pain management doc, right? So you can go to a pain management doctor and get medicine to manage your pain, right? And once you get that medicine, you're gonna take it, it's gonna manage your pain, and then you'll have to do what? Go back, and you'll have to keep taking it and get more and more, right? But then you have internal medicine docs that are all about getting to the root cause or the issue that is causing it, right? Although it's a longer journey and sometimes it's a harder process and it may take longer to get or resolve it, it gets to the core issue so that you no longer have to deal with it. So that's what we're talking about when we look at documents like this.
So this is really challenging information to look at, but if you liken it to the pain management doc, like Aaron was saying, there's nothing wrong with pain management. So there's nothing wrong with all of our nonprofits focusing on symptoms. We need that. We need the symptoms to be managed. But we also have a responsibility to address the cause at the same time as managing the symptoms. That's just a better quality of care. And so we've got to start getting organizations to understand the core issues so that they're willing to do that work while they're addressing the symptom management. We've got to get the funders to understand the issue so that they give the organizations the freedom to focus on the things that are most important, not just the things that will produce the quickest outcomes. It can't be based off of the numbers of people that you see and the number of people that you serve. It has to really be moving the needle. And sometimes that'll take longer, so funders have to be willing to fund knowing that they may not see results or outcomes for a few years. That's a shift in our community. We like to fund things where we can see that it's being utilized, where we like to see the impact and the numbers. We want to see that needle move right away, but it doesn't get at the deeper level or the systemic thing. So we've got to start to shift away from those easy fixes.
So what I'd like to do at this time to kind of get you guys more involved, and I'll take your question first or your comment first, and then we'll get into a short activity.
In the middle, there was a circle that said church support of other methods. What does that mean?
So church support of other methods down here in the bottom left. we're obviously, as I mentioned earlier, we're believers and we do a lot of work within our churches. And what we know to be true is that, so I'll say this, how many churches do we think are in Southeast Fort Wayne? If you had to guess, just throw out numbers. 100? What are 50? There are 106 churches in Southeast Fort Wayne. Alone. That's just in Southeast Fort Wayne, right? So what we have a lot of times is we have a lot of individual churches that go out and get funding and throw, you have community events that try to get people to come to the church, right, or things of that nature. And what we're talking about when we talk about, and people get funding to those events. And there's nothing wrong with that because churches have to keep their doors open, feed their congregations and all those good things. But if we could get individual churches, those 106 churches, to have an external focus outside of their walls and do kingdom work, right? And that God calls us all to be one body and do kingdom work outside of their four walls. Imagine what that looks like. Imagine what happens to a lot of those issues. Because our churches are full of people who are passionate about these issues and doing the work, but they're staying siloed in their own churches. So if we can get them outside of their congregations and outside of their walls, imagine what that impact would look like with 106 churches.
Are you seeing any progress on that with the city movement that's out of Mike Packnett and at the Miro Center? Have you seen any development on that front happening in Southeast Fort Wayne?
Yes. And I say yes kind of hesitantly because we recently been having a lot of conversations around that. And even that, and I don't know how honest you want me to be.
We can talk later. It's all right.
I don't even know what I'm gonna say. No, so there has been progress. I will say there's been progress in that our city right now has a lot of momentum spiritually. Like you can just feel God moving. There's a lot of people spiritually that are starting to unify and come together. I think if we're going to be really honest, we have to take a hard look at how to be more inclusive of the churches within Southeast.
There we go.
And that requires maybe being flexible in time of day of when we meet, maybe where we meet, and things like that. So, and those conversations are happening. Those conversations are taking place. But I think another thing is not just how do we mobilize the churches within Southeast, those 106, how many churches are outside of Southeast? And what are we called to do spiritually? Not just to focus on the areas immediately around us and those that look most like us or worship like us or that we're most comfortable with, it's the underserved. We're called to focus on the populations that need most. And so we've got to also mobilize other churches in other areas to really address core issues. But part of it requires that you get to know people and you hear what the core issues are from them directly. And you don't just assume that you know because you don't know what you don't know. And so if there's an initiative that starts any place other than with the people that it's intended to serve, then that is a problem. We can't make a plan over here and rally all the troops and get the funding together over here to implement something. Then we implement it, and this is common in our community, and we're not seeing the type of engagement that we want to see. Then the question comes, well, what's wrong with the people? Do they want to be helped? They do, but what you're focused on just isn't priority for this population. If you are in an underserved area and you're in survival mode, you might not necessarily want to focus on some of the things that somebody who isn't in survival mode thinks is priority. And so we've got to start with the people.
You said that so eloquently, much better than I would have.
I know.
So I'd like to do a short activity, and if you have paper, you can do this on your own note paper, or you can kind of just do this in your head. So what I'd like you to do is we're going to do what we call the stress test. So I'd like you to look at these two lists, or columns, if you will, and identify what do you think, and you can kind of work with your neighbor and talk with the individuals around you for a moment or two here. What do you think are the top 3 stressors for people in our community? The top 3 stressors.
Community overall or Southeast?
Community overall. Yep, community overall. And you can kind of talk amongst each other.
You can only choose 3. That's the challenge.
This is designed to stress you out.
All right. Now that you've been able to have a little conversation with that, how many of you have come up with your top three? Or somewhat? Okay. So now, in order to make this a little more stressful for you, we now want to include these two lists. So looking at these, choose your top three stressors that you believe as a community. Top three stressors. You want to explain it?
Okay, for the sake of time, we're going to reel it back in. We see people still discussing. And this is challenging. You could literally probably process through this for another 20 minutes to try to figure out a comprehensive, just 3-item list. The two columns in the middle are the ones that were from the first list, which are all the most common stressors. And then the two lists that came in are common stressors when you live in an underserved area. So these are common stressors from within Southeast Fort Wayne. And so there are some segments of the population we do trainings for, where they do this activity and they kind of go through individually and they check, which ones are most stressful for them or which ones they've experienced. And, there are some groups that we train where they only have a few of these. And then there are other segments of the population we train where they check the entire list. And so stress is a normal part of life. It's something we all go through. Stress is normal. The issue becomes when you have compound stress. So when there's stressor after stressor after stressor, or there's prolonged stress over time, then you get into something called toxic stress. So toxic stress defined is the body's physiological and cognitive response to situations and or events that overwhelm us and make us feel like we are in serious danger. And it can leave us feeling powerless. Toxic stress is caused by prolonged, frequent, or intense levels of the body's natural stress response. So your natural stress response is designed to keep you alive and keep you safe, and it's good, it's healthy. But when you are exposed to prolonged levels of that natural stress response or multiple compound stressors, it becomes really unhealthy. And so on this diagram at the bottom, there's positive stress, which is called eustress. You may have heard of that term before, which is just basic life things like graduation, having a baby. If anybody had a baby, you know that's some stress. It's good, you love your baby, but it's stressful. And then tolerable stress is like a loss of a family member, but with support and buffers in place. So like if you lose someone, it's hard, it's painful, but if you have support and counseling, over time, you never get over it, but you learn to live with it. But then there's toxic stress, and this is like witnessing domestic violence in the home, or like chronic neglect, where your fight or flight response is activated over time. And so You might have heard of the fight or flight response before. That's fight, flight, or freeze, and that's where there's you see something or experience something and there's a risk, and so your body, to keep you alive, is naturally designed to start pumping cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone, like a stress response, and it makes your heart beat faster. It makes your blood go to your extremities and pump away from the center so that if you need to fight or flee, you have more blood pumping to your extremities. Your pupils actually dilate. Your heart rate increases. You're breathing more shallow so that you can breathe faster to fight or flee. And this is naturally designed to keep you alive. You would need that if you're fighting. The issue with it is when your fight or flight response is activated, your digestion slows, because at the time when you're in a risky situation, your body doesn't need to prioritize digesting food. It needs to prioritize survival and fighting. And so when you're in a stressful situation, let's say you're in the woods, you see a bear, you need that. When you're at home sitting on your couch, you don't. And the reality is there's a segment of our population that lives in fight or flight all the time because of compound stressor after stressor after stressor. So from a mental and emotional health perspective, those are the types of issues that we're addressing, this toxic chronic stress and the impact long term. And so what happens is it's easy to get irritated by a coworker or that employee or that person who you just really don't understand why they respond the way that they respond. Part of it could be that they're activated. But you start looking at some of those systemic issues like, like crime rates, increased crime rates. Why is crime more prevalent in certain areas of town? Well, if more people are already activated and you need to survive, you might do whatever you need to do to survive. You might be more irritable and on edge because you got cortisol pumping through your body. So it makes sense from a physiological perspective why some of those things take place. And then you get things passed down from generation to generation because environments are filled with toxic stuff. Or babies can also be baked in cortisol. If you're stressed during a pregnancy, your baby can be baked in cortisol, which means your baby will be born with a higher propensity to be anxious. And so you start to see some of the generational breakdown and how things can be transmitted over time and continue to decline. So that gets us into adverse childhood experiences. A lot of you have probably heard about ACEs. We'll skip the video for the sake of time. I'll just explain it very, very briefly. Thank you. And so with ACEs, it is an assessment that you take. It basically shows that experiences and things that you go through as a child can impact your overall well-being later in life as an adult. So it was a study that was done that found that people that have negative health outcomes and like incarceration rates and just overall negative life outcomes have usually had negative childhood experiences or adverse childhood experiences. And this has like physical abuse, emotional abuse, seeing abuse in the home, substance abuse, divorce, there's sexual abuse, there's incarcerated parents or relatives, mental illness, just lots of different issues. There's a quick assessment that you can take and the link is at the end of the presentation if you are interested in what your ACE score would be. But just briefly, I'll tell you that lots of people were veterans and went to war, but the common denominator of which people went to war that developed PTSD was that all the vets that went to war, I would say 99%, but maybe not that high. I'm speaking from my own knowledge, not from something I read. But one of the highest indicators of if they developed PTSD or not was that they had adverse childhood experiences. So if you have had adverse childhood experiences, you have more of a likelihood to develop PTSD or to have an adverse reaction to trauma later in life. So again, if there are people who you work with, who you're encountering that have personalities that you don't understand, that have ways of thinking and behaving that you don't understand, it's easy to be critical and to judge, but we want you to develop an empathetic lens. And empathy, we all kind of have heard the definition of empathy, of putting yourself in someone else's shoes. Well, we did a race and culture talk recently led by Ira Headley, and he challenged us to stretch our view of empathy and to start redefining empathy to where now, instead of it being putting yourself in someone else's shoes, because there's some experience you can't put yourself in someone else's shoes, you haven't had them. Haven't had those experiences, you wouldn't even know what that's like. It's just, the new definition is when someone tells you what is true for them and of their experience, that you believe them. And not only do you believe them, but you act accordingly. Instead of asking, are you sure? Is that really what it is? Are you just being sensitive? Or you really believe that what they're saying is true and that they know enough to know the truth? And then that you act accordingly. You can't forget the act accordingly part of it.
So when it comes to cultural competence, this is a continuum. It's a spectrum. So if I asked everybody in this room when we first came in here, how many of you need cultural competency training, right? Not many hands would just be like, oh, me, I need to learn more about culture. I need more cultural competency training, because the reality is we all feel like we're culturally competent. We all feel as though we have friends that don't look like us. We sit in meetings with people who don't look like us. So we get what being cultural competent is, and we do this well as a community, right? We're Midwest nice. But what we know to be true is many individuals fall right in the middle in cultural blindness. And the reason that is because how many of you have heard the saying, or even, you don't have to raise your hand, but even live by the saying, I don't see color? Right? We've all heard that before, right? I don't see color. Well, how do you know what to do at a stoplight? Right? That's cultural blindness, because the reality is people of color that don't look like you want you to see color. We want you to see the uniqueness about us. We want you to see all the things that make us who we are, right? Those are the things that make us different, that make us unique. So we want you to see those things, but then it comes to being able to embrace those things that help us, again, be more culturally sensitive, competent, and then proficient.
So if you're going to know me and be in relationship with me and really have a deep connection with me, you have to see my color. It's a huge piece of who I am. There's history and there's context there. There's a history in our country that impacts us all. We all have a shared history of discrimination, of racism, of different wins that we've shared as a country. But we're all impacted by it. And to see me and not see a part of my historical context and who I am, it robs me of truly feeling like you get me and that you connect with me. So there's a video that we show here that's really powerful, but we don't have time to show it because we're mindful of time and we don't want to take people over. It's called The Race of Life if you want to look it up yourself, but it's about white privilege. And white privilege is one of the most controversial aspects of race and culture talks ever. Nobody likes to talk about it. It's hard to talk about. I don't want to talk about it. I'll be honest, that's why I'm glad that we're short on time right now, to be honest with you. But there is a difference between privilege and guilt. And the way I can summarize it best, I heard someone speak about it where they said that when you wake up in the morning, you're not aware that you have two arms. You don't wake up grateful to have two arms. And you're not aware of it unless you were to lose an arm. And so if you had two arms, you wouldn't wake up in the morning and say, I'm privileged, unless you had a friend or someone in your family that had one arm. And so it's that type of dynamic of that where you can be poor with two arms and not feel privileged because you were poor and you went through different things in life in your upbringing that challenged you. But if you were next to someone who was poor and had one arm, then you would feel privileged. So it's not about, it's about that you don't have to wake up in the morning aware of something that will be looked at as a negative by the world. You may be poor, but nobody would know that unless you disclosed. And so that's really what privilege is about, and it's too hard to summarize in a short period of time, and you can have lots of dialogue about it, but some applicable things to apply, because there's work here for all of us, not just for white people. There's work for minority populations as well, and part of what we can do as minority populations is creating safety around cultural conversations. Not to be confused with carrying guilt so that white people don't have to feel it. Because that is a common experience that people of color share, that they have gone through, is it's hard to have talks about race and culture because you don't want to make people feel guilty, but then you also don't want to absorb the emotions so that people who are white don't have to feel them. We should all feel them, and honestly, we do. Our historical context in our country impacts all of us. It brings up negative emotions for all of us, not just for people of color. We're all impacted by racism. We're all impacted by slavery and the institution of slavery and the history of that. We're all impacted by it, but we've got to be able to start talking about it. In the same way we talk about the Holocaust, where we say, always remember, always remember, always remember. But when it's slavery, it's, are you still talking about that? Are you being sensitive? Don't make it about race. Well, the difference between the Holocaust and slavery was the position that the U.S. took, the position that white Americans had. In one, they were the hero. In the other, they were the villain. You always want to remember times where you were the hero, but it's hard to think about times where a mistake was made. Nobody wants their face rubbed in a mistake, and that's what makes these conversations challenging. So as minority populations, we can make safety around cultural conversations, and then understand that there's no place for guilt. Guilt doesn't get us anywhere. Guilt leads to shame and avoidance, and then atypical behavior or immoral behavior because you want to cover up the guilt. That's from a mental health perspective. Any issues that are causing guilt, that doesn't lead to healing. You don't want to get people to a place of guilt. And then for the majority population, acknowledging that privilege exists and being able to acknowledge that there are traumatic experiences, that racism is real, and that it's not just something that's made up or people are being sensitive. Just acknowledging and affirming the experience and the reality of it is healing in itself.
So as I know we're out of time, I'll share when this became real to me. I was having a conversation with, we go to City Church, and we were having a conversation with our pastor, Pastor Chris Freeman, who's a young white pastor. And we were having a conversation, and he was sharing with me the realization he had about white privilege. And he was talking to another pastor who was much older, and this pastor said to him, you know, Chris, we have it really easy. We have it pretty good. He said, as white men, we can go through life, and if we chose to, we could go through life and never interact with another population that don't look like us, a population of color, and we can still be successful, we can still be educated, we can still advance in life without any problems. But for our counterparts, people of color, they have to interact with people who don't look like them and with the white population in order to progress and make it in life. And he said, and when that pastor said that to them, he was like, wow, I've never looked at it that way. So when he and I were having this conversation, it just really clicked for me that that's what privilege is, right? It's not having to adapt to different situations or try to be something that you're not in order to make it or progress in a world that was really set up for your success. Whereas for some of us, we have to, again, constantly adapt. You give the analogy about the fish out of water, and then we can kind of end with.
So I was reading a book recently, and I think it was White Awake that I was reading, and he talked about whiteness being normed and how it's just what is. It's life as usual and what is. And so he likened it to a fish in water. Like a fish doesn't notice the water that it's swimming in because it's normal. That's their normal environment. It's not until the fish is pulled from the water that it gasps to breathe. And he likened the experience of many white Americans where they're not aware of whiteness or white culture or how normed it is until they bump up against someone who either thinks they're racist or they witness a racially charged situation that someone else is involved with. It's this gasping of just this awareness in that moment all of a sudden. And so he likened it to that experience of these aha moments of where all of a sudden you become aware of whiteness and how whiteness is normed.
So we had a few more slides, but again, for time purposes, we'll end with this. When we talk about how do we get better at this, we're the answer, right? The individual sitting in this room, no matter your race, no matter your socioeconomic status, no matter your job title, no matter what position you hold, we're the answers to solving these issues. Because as a people, we're called to do this work. And it starts with us, first and foremost, from an self-awareness standpoint of where am I on this, right? That's for you to answer. Where am I when it comes to this? And then, how do I open myself up to continue to learning from other people who look like me and don't look like me, who are also on this journey of solving these issues? And then how do I surround myself with other people who don't look like me to learn their experiences? And then have my new definition of empathy, and believe them, and then act accordingly, right? So this whole notion of diversity, right? Everybody's heard this coin term diversity. Everybody's talking about, I want more diversity in the workplace. I want to be more diverse, all of this, right? It's everywhere. But diversity is one thing, inclusion is another. Diversity is inviting someone to the dance. Inclusion is inviting them to dance. So we have to get past just doing diversity and putting people in the room who don't look like us and actually asking them to dance, which means we get their voice, we get their opinion, and then we value it and do something with it, okay? So the responsibility is all of ours as we move forward in this. Again, this talk and presentation was not to make anyone feel guilty, was not to make anyone feel bad, but it is a reality, and it's about awareness, and it's about the work that we have to do as a people and as a community to see our entire community move forward and our entire city move forward, because we are better together.
And we just ask that you guys continue to keep us in prayer or in your thoughts if you're not a praying person, because this isn't easy work to do. It's really hard to have these conversations. If you're doing really good talks on diversity, you're disturbing what people know. You're disturbing their comfort zone. In your mind, you should be arguing with some of the stuff that we're saying, because it's stretching your perspective. You're gonna have conversations about this later. You're gonna argue with us later when we're not even with you. That's great. That means we're doing it well. So it's really just stretching your perspective. It's not shifting or changing your perspective. It's just stretching it. And so we pray that you guys just continue to do the work yourselves, that you continue to keep us lifted as we do the work, and that you just have more of a perspective and lens on this. Thank you guys so much for your time.